Well, welcome everyone. My name is Samantha Poulos-Fargione. I'm the Executive Director here at the Weston Historical Society. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for our lecture with John Solum about the artist James Daugherty. Now, before we begin, I just want to recognize our 1920s event sponsors, Tito's Handmade Vodka, Leslie D. and William Weiss III, Amy Jenner, Black Bear Wine and Spirits, Newburgh Brewing Company, and Peter's Spirit Shop of Weston. Now, I know, it's a little difficult to view the exhibit in its entirety tonight because we do have tables and cases and chairs in the way. So we invite you to come back and view our exhibit. It's an extensive exhibit. There's more upstairs and then down around the hallway in our conference room. So our exhibit is open every Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday, starting on October 16th, and Sunday from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. And the exhibit is called Weston Slept While the Nation Roared, Life in the 1920s. So please come back, visit us, and take your time exploring the exhibit. So I want to recognize one of our trustees, Skip Schaefer, because Skip was the person who introduced us to the wonderful John Solum. When we were starting our journey on putting this exhibit together, as we were going through all of our research, looking at all the artists that made Weston their home in the 1920s, Skip had mentioned John Solum and his connection to the Friends of the James Daugherty Foundation. And so we met with John, and John, thank you so much for loaning the beautiful original pieces of artwork, as well as a huge collection of your books illustrated by James Daugherty. So thank you, John, and thank you, Skip, for helping us make this wonderful connection. So before I turn the evening over to John, I want to read his bio. So John Solum is a classical musician. He's performed in 37 countries and made numerous recordings. He has lived in Westport for 46 years. Mr. Solum has been a dedicated advocate of the art of James Daugherty for over 2 decades and is a trustee of the Friends of James Daugherty Foundation. So without further ado, I present John Solum.
Thank I have enough distance that I can take this off. And I want to thank the Board of Trustees of the Weston Historical Society for inviting me to speak this evening. And Leslie and Samantha for setting up and organizing this. First, I'd like to say about my credentials. For 27 years, since I bought my first James Daugherty work, I've been an advocate of his. He had already died, but I got to know his son, Charles, and Charles's wife, Lisa. And I enjoyed their friendship very much, and we together handled the estate. Lisa died in 2014, and we set up a foundation, had already set up a foundation to handle the approximately 2,500 works by James Daugherty, as well as works by Lisa and Charles, and the sale of the house. So I am not a scholar of art history. I'm speaking as a trustee of our foundation. So that means I can use words like great and fabulous that scholars are forbidden to use. So I'd like to say a word about the pronunciation of James Daugherty. Now, I've seen many people stumble when they get to his last name. So I asked Charles, how do you pronounce your name? And he said, there are three ways. You can say Doherty, you can say Doherty, or you can use the Irish pronunciation, which is Doherty, with the kind of sound. So he said, it doesn't matter. Now, I listened to a film produced by Weston Woods on James Daugherty, and he referred to his wife as Mrs. Doherty. So I've learned to pronounce it as if it were an O, Doherty. I would like to encourage you to look at the works that we've lent from our foundation by James Daugherty. That is a self-portrait that was done a little later than the 20s, but I think all the other works are from the 20s. And this large work here is an original illustration for this book here. And you can see how they reduce it down in size. And I'm sure Doherty, James, after he created a masterwork like that, he must have cried when he saw what the publishers did in reducing it down. This isn't even as bad as some of the others I've seen. Now, there are two other Weston illustrators who were active in the 20s. One was William Prince, this guy. And he is best known for his covers for the Country Gentleman magazine. He did dozens and dozens of them. And they remind me of Norman Rockwell. They are very beautifully painted. They are anecdotal. They are real people doing real things. And the job of the cover of the magazine was to sell the magazine. So you see the story and you say, oh, I've got to figure out what this is all about. So it's anecdotal. Then he was a little younger than James Daugherty, 6 years younger. John Held, Jr., his images defined the jazz age. And he invented the flapper girl. Now, we can see here James Daugherty's version of a flapper girl. And this, we think of Fred Astaire dancing, and Held became quite famous in the 20s. He never graduated from high school. He was born in Salt Lake City. And one of his art teachers out there was the sculptor Mahanrai Young, the grandson of Brigham Young, who founded the Mormon Church. Well, it's a small world. Mahanrai Young eventually ended up in Connecticut, and he married the daughter of J. Alden Weir. That's Weir Farm. So he lived many years at Weir Farm. He became a part of this community. So Held, I think his greatest accomplishment was illustrating some of F. Scott Fitzgerald's books. Now there's another local guy. He lived on Campo Road South, the last house before you get to the golf course, and on the right. And anyway, the books that he did include Tales of the Jazz Age, 1922, The Beautiful and the Damned, and the Pulitzer Prize winning book called So Big. Now, this is a big deal for a Weston artist, and it's even been recognized by the United States government. In 2009, I have to, 2001, the US government issued a postage stamp, John Hill Jr. I think that's one of the ultimate honors you can get, is to be on a, I wonder how many other Weston residents have been on a postage stamp. We know that a Westport resident got on one, Paul Newman. Now, let's answer the question, why did James Daugherty move from New York City to Connecticut in 1923? He had moved to Brooklyn in 1911. He lived in a brick house that still exists, a brick apartment house, right next to the Brooklyn Bridge. If you know where Dumbo is, this is just across the bridge to the south. It's right where Brooklyn Heights is. And then within a year, he got married to Sonia, who had come to this country from Russia. And his son, Charles, their only child, was born in 1913. So there they were as a family raising an infant in New York City. I tried it, and I can tell you how difficult it is. You can't just say, go out and play. Every minute of the child's life has to be organized. And this was a time when James took up some employment that took him away from New York. He painted camouflage on ships in Baltimore and Philadelphia in lieu of active duty in the military. So he was paid by the government to paint the sides of ships. And I have a couple of these are the original things that they gave him. There were dozens and dozens of them. Here's another one. So that took him away for months. I don't have the dates when he was away, but it left Sonia to raise Charles all by herself. And the other project that took him away in 1921, he got a commission to paint murals for the Lowe State Theater in Cleveland. And that took him away for 6 weeks. And he painted 4 murals, each of which was 10 feet high and 46 feet long. 4 of them. They still exist. So I think being away from his family was just too difficult for both of them. Connecticut was cheap, and there was already an artistic tradition in Connecticut in the late 19th to early 20th centuries. He bought a circa 1750 farmhouse with 13 acres at 33 Broad Street. And we have one of the current tenants, owners, Benny Ranelli. Would you raise your hand there, Benny? Yes. And she comes from a family that respects artistic and craftsmanship, and she knows the value of the house. And so it's being well maintained. And she lives there with Lei Zong, her husband, and 2 boys who have enjoyed and are attending Weston High School. Now, I would like to talk about the arts as they existed around 1920 when Doherty moved out here. There was a lot of activity going on. And the visual arts tradition included Cos Cob Artist Colony in Greenwich, and John Henry Trachtman, who was one of the founders of that in the late 19th century. We've already mentioned J. Alden Weir. He had a farm on the border of Wilton and Ridgefield. The Silver Mine Guild in New Canaan was just being formed in 1922-23 when Doherty was thinking of coming here. And we have to give credit to Solum Borglum, who was one of the persons behind it, pulling that together. He was the brother of Gutzon Borglum of Mount Rushmore fame, 2 sculptors. And then in Westport, there was George Hand Wright. He's known as the father of illustration, the illustration crowd in Westport. And then there was also Arthur Dove in Westport. Now, he was living at that time with another artist named Helen Torr, T-O-R-R. Dove was a Cornell graduate, and he was an illustrator in New York City. He knew Stieglitz, who was his dealer to the end of his life. And also, he had a monthly stipend from Duncan Phillips of the Phillips Collection in Washington. So he lived on Campo Road South also. Now, his house used to exist. I saw it. And it's where Campo Road goes underneath I-95 and the train tracks. On the east side, going north, it's the 3rd house. Well, it had a fire a few years ago, and rather than restore it, it was called Dove Cottage. rather than restore it, they tore it down and built what may be the ugliest house in Weston. So we love to tear down houses in this area. And so Dove, and of course, at the same time, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda lived about a half a mile on Copper Road South. I told you, just before the golf course, the last house. It makes me wonder, did Dove and Fitzgerald know each other? Anyway, moving up the coast, John Lafarge, his son Bansal, and Tom Lafarge lived summers in Hamden, Connecticut. And then, of course, there's Florence Griswold in Old Lyme, and she had an art colony, Impressionist painters, and I have to say, that museum, it's not only the house, but they built a separate building for it. It's thriving. They have a list a mile long of sponsors and contributors. It's an extremely well-run facility, and they bought all the land around it that Florence Griswold owned. So it's a complete entity now. So that's what was going on in Connecticut at the time that James Daugherty bought 33 Broad Street in Weston. Now I'd like to discuss a little bit how was James Daugherty different from Prince and Hell. Those two guys were illustrators through and through. Daugherty, yes, he was an illustrator, but he got interested in modernism. He aspired to be a modernist artist. He saw the Armory Show in New York in 1913, which introduced modern art to America, and he was bowled over. So, futurism, color principles, which we call synchronism, cubism, and pure abstraction. So, now I'm getting to the point where I'm going to start showing you some surprising works. I'm going to let James Daugherty seduce you. Here was a poster that he did for World War I. This was one of the great posters in World War I. And this is one of 5 posters that he did, and it's one of the smaller ones.
Is his name on there?
Yes, he signed it
Oh, good.
right here.
Yeah.
Yep. This is collectible, by the way.
Yeah.
Yes. So, now I'm going to show you he got into pure abstraction. And this is a purely abstract painting that he did at about that time. There is another painting of the same size and on this kind of tagboard at the Smithsonian American Museum in Washington. So now he was just applying different colors. So this is one of the earliest purely abstract paintings by an American artist. It's not dated, but stylistically we can date it to about 1915. The other one who's given credit for being the first abstract painter in America is Arthur Dove. And I can't help but feel that they must have known what each was doing, because Dove's paintings are not very big either. This doesn't hold up in a museum because it's so small. Now, the distinguished art historian William Agee, who knew James Daugherty, says about his kind of abstract work, quote, "The paint became the form. It was in itself the physical and expressive reality of the work." So that's an important quote. Now, half of Doherty's output in the 20s was biblical. He was interested in illustrating the Bible. It never came to fruition, but he in addition to his abstract work, he did the Bible. He did illustrations for the Bible. Now I'm going to show you some, before I get there, I want to show you, here is a futurist drawing by him from about 1915. Here is a futurist drawing. Here is a cubist drawing, which actually is a biblical subject. It's from Revelation. Here is one of his crayon abstract drawings. Now, we're down to his biblical. Here is a study for the painting that's at Yale. It's an angel. But look at his use of color. It's astonishing.
Is it the Yale Art Gallery, you think?
It's in the Société Anonyme collection at Yale. And much of that is not on display.
I was going to say, I've not seen that there. I go there all the time.
You can go online and they have an off-site space where the paintings that they don't show you in the galleries, they are in storage, and they can't prevent, you can see them.
Yeah.
Yes, you have to ask. And they have, several years ago, we gave them another watercolor to go with it, but we kept this one. This is called the Rest on the Flight into Egypt. This is a stormy sea. At the sepulcher, 3 figures approaching the sepulcher. But look at the colors. Satan tempting Christ. This is Satan. And going back to non-biblical, this is Washington Square, where he lived. These all are before he moved to Weston. So this is Washington Square, and he's showing the activity, that's the swirl of activity. And here is you see the arch. So I know that this is Washington Square.
Yeah.
Yeah. Victory in World War I. So this is called Onward to Victory.
The tag fell.
Yes, I see that. And now, around this time, he had been invited to submit ideas for the Cleveland Murals. So you can tell by the shapes of these that he was working out ideas for the Cleveland Murals. So this is the prairie out west. It's the prairie family. And here is Henry Hudson. But brilliant colors. And now I'm going to show you the only 2 surviving studies for the Cleveland Murals. There were 4 murals, and each one represented a continent. So this is Asia. Am I holding these high enough?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you tilt it a little bit so that the light catches it better from above?
Oh, yeah, that's great, thank you. Is that a mural somewhere now?
In Cleveland?
It's at the State Theater in Cleveland.
Thank you.
And
We've been there.
Yeah.
Have you?
they still exist. They are honored and respected in Cleveland.
Sure.
They know what they have. And I went out there many years ago, and the varnish was discolored. So I made them, clean them. It took 4 people, professionals, a year, and the cost was $200,000.
Wow.
I made them raise the money. Otherwise, the murals might have been destroyed.
Sure.
And
Interesting. 6 weeks to paint them and a year to clean them.
And here's another mural. This is Africa. Now, these are studies, and they are 1 inch to a foot. In other words, he brought these with him, and I have a photograph of him painting one of these, and you can see this was right there with him.
Yeah.
And none of the other studies exist. He must have just been so anxious to get back to New York to be with Sonia, his wife, and Charles, that he just threw them all away
Wow.
and brought these 2 back. Now, he continued with his mural work and painted 7 murals in the high school, the music room of the high school in Stamford. And then some architect decided to lower the ceiling, you know, to hide the air conditionings. And so the murals were in the way. 7 murals. So they ripped them off the walls and threw them out. Now, so it's been one of my activities to get those murals back on walls. So I'm happy to say that 5 of them have been put back on walls elsewhere, not in the music room, in Stamford. And the most recent acquisition, David Geffen had bought one of the murals called American Rhythm, and they were at his MCA headquarters, his music business in Santa Barbara, California, in the entry foyer. And now he's moved back to New York. He's got tons of money, and so he's giving $100 million to the Museum of Modern Art and $100 million to Lincoln Center, and he gave the drama school at Yale is named for David Geffen, and you get the picture. $100 million is chicken feed for him. Well, he gave us the mural that he owned. He gave it back, and it's now in the Rogers International School in Stamford, south of I-95. And this is what the mural looks like. It's about 30 feet wide, and it's called American Rhythm. And if you want to see it, it's a knockout. The colors don't come through on this print, but this came from MCA Music when he owned this mural. So.
What is the building that it's in Stamford?
Pardon?
What building in Stanford?
Is this in the school?
Oh, it's called the Rogers International School. It's exit 9 on the turnpike. And when you get off exit, there's a road that goes over the turnpike, and you go about 1/4 of a mile south of the turnpike. And then there's a stop sign, and you make a left turn, and on your right will be the school. It has a sod roof. You'll see weeds growing in the roof.
That's very green.
Yes. And it's thrilling to see this, to get this back for Stanford.
Is there a catalog raisonné of James Daugherty's work?
No,
Why?
I once thought of doing it, but when Charles died, we hired an art appraiser to appraise the art. 2,500 works.
Of Charles and James, both?
Just James. Would you like to do the catalog resume? And so 1,000 of them now have been placed in museums. And for example, my alma mater, Princeton, has a children's book library in their library. It's called the Kotzen Library. We gave them 500 illustrations for books, original illustrations, 500 in one fell swoop. This is what you do when you want to preserve works. You get them to where they're safe and appreciated. So, well, that actually brings us to the third thing that makes him different from the other two here. He went into book illustration. Big time. In his lifetime, he illustrated or wrote 104 books. In the 1920s, just to be specific to this period, he illustrated 27 books. And almost every year, he did books until 1971. Virtually all of the publishers in New York sought his services. He was the darling of the publishing world in England, in New York, for original illustrations. I once had the pleasure of sitting next to Howard Fast, a Connecticut, well-known Connecticut writer, novelist, and I told him I was promoting James Daugherty. He said to me, "Oh yes, I know his work. He was the illustrator whose every illustration was a work of art." And I've never forgotten Howard Fast commenting on that. There are illustrators, and then there's James Daugherty. Now, the last part of my talk, I want to talk about Connecticut since the Roaring '20s. It's been 100 years, and there's something special about Connecticut. This state has attracted not just artists, but writers, architects, sculptors, poets. It goes on and on. And I think there are reasons for this. One is its proximity to New York City. We like to think that New York is the art capital of the country. But after New York, these people come out here to Connecticut. Connecticut, as a state, has nooks and crannies, beautiful beaches, hills, streams, rocky outcrops, charm. Now, if I were a scholar, I would, with my PhD, I would have to say, well, we can't prove anything. But I know in my heart that that's why these people have moved here, because of the charm of Connecticut and the nooks and the crannies. I grew up in the Midwest, where it's flat. The roads go north, south, east, and west. Every corner is a right angle. And after you drive for 6 or 8 hours, you begin to fantasize, what would a hill look like? Well, here we are. Aren't we lucky to live in such a remarkably beautiful state? So, I wanted to talk about 2 groups of artists, of art, using the word art meaning all the arts, here in Weston. One is Fritz Reiner. He was a conductor, and he was born in Budapest, and he came over here. He had studied with Bartók, and he conducted the Cincinnati Symphony, and then the Pittsburgh Symphony, and in the 50s and 60s, he conducted the Chicago Symphony, and that was the height of his career. Now, he lived in a place called Rambleside on Davis Hill Road. You can't see it from Davis Hill Road. The road leading into it is too long, and there's a little hill. Hey, hill! But you can see it from the extension of Steep Hill Road, which once it crosses Davis Hill Road, it loops around, and there's some newer houses there. And you look to your left, you look west, and there's a Tudor brick mansion. That's where Fritz Reiner lived.
And Bartók visited him there.
And,
Bartók visited him.
oh, I'm sure he did.
And his grave, we just saw it a few years ago, is up in that lovely cemetery down right near Westport, the Four Corners, or sorry, North Campo, that was designed by the same man who designed the Central Park.
Yes,
It's a beautiful.
Olmsted.
Olmsted, thank you.
yes. Willowbrook Cemetery.
Willowbrook, thank you.
So that's where Fritz Reiner is buried,
Okay.
and his wife Carlotta. Well, and then at the other end of town, we have Georges Balanchine. That's quite a story. He lived on Ridge Road, just where Norfield Road heads down a steep hill to Newtown Turnpike. And I did see his house when it was still there. It, of course, was not a big house. It was a cottage, but you could see the wheelchair access on the north side of the house where Tanakil Leclerc made her entrance, because she was his last wife, and she had been a dancer at the New York City Ballet, and she had polio. So, but at the time that Balanchine, we celebrated his 100th birthday, I mean, he was deceased, but the world celebrated his birthday with mounting productions of his many ballets. And that's when his house in Weston met its demise. And it's been replaced with the Center Hall Colonial, surrounded by a wall.
Can I tell a cute short story about our local Kiwanis Club and Lecoq after she survived Balanchine? She lived in a little cottage, but was an invalid. She had a difficult time getting around.
Yes.
And we at Kiwanis would periodically, especially in the cold weather, bring free wood piles to people who needed wood. And she had a wood burning stove, but she had a hard time getting to it, or getting up the nerve to go out to it. And one of our leaders, whose name was L.B. Burr, part of the old Burr family here in Weston, discovered that she would not go out and get the wood, but that she really enjoyed a glass of scotch or bourbon. And so he salted the wood pile that we delivered onto her front porch with little Mickeys that you used to get on the airplanes of scotch
Yes.
and bourbon.
Yes.
And she would go out and get her piece of wood, or two or three, and a little Mickey of bourbon.
Well, so I would like to say that perhaps Balanchine is the greatest celebrity and artistic person who ever lived in Weston. He is internationally renowned. He choreographed 400 ballets, over 400. He was from Russia, and he was invited here in 1933 by a man named Lincoln Kirstein. Now, Lincoln Kirstein also lived walking distance from Balanchine's house. And Lincoln Kirstein's wife was Fidelma Kipnis, and the sister of Paul Kipnis, and he lived there too. So between Balanchine, Kirstein, and Kipnis, you had a little group, each contributing to the artistic vitality of the world, not just Weston. I wanted to say a little bit about Kirstein. He attended Harvard, and his classmates included Philip Johnson. Hey, another Connecticut name. The Glass House in New Canaan, we all know. So, Kirstein, with Balanchine, formed the School of the American Ballet in 1934 in Hartford. And 2 years later, it became the Ballet Caravan. Now, this is the predecessor of the New York City Ballet. Now, the Ballet Caravan toured. It lasted for about 3 years, and it toured around in a bus. Except Kirstein didn't like to travel in a bus. So, since he had a private income, the Filene department store family in Boston, he could afford to drive a car rather than ride on the bus. And he needed help. And to drive, and one of his helpers was Charles Doherty.
Oh.
Now, this is still New York City, by the way. I don't know when Balanchine and Bernstein moved, and Kipnis moved out to Weston, but it wasn't in the 30s. And this is a portrait of 22-year-old Charles in 1936, drawn by Paul Kipnis.
Oh,
Wow.
And this was the same year that he drove with Bernstein on the southern tour that took them to Savannah and Cuba. And Kipnis was a peerless draftsman. His only rival was James Daugherty, well, and a few others. But Kipnis, he had a slightly nasty streak in him. He did things that no one else would think of. And, for example, here's a portrait of Charles with his elbows up in the air. Well, what a funny way to do a portrait. But that's exactly what Kipnis would do. So,
How was that done? Is that pen, ink, what?
what?
How was that done? Ink or?
It's dated 1934.
Okay, but is it done with charcoal or with pen and ink?
Oh,
You know?
it's charcoal and,
Tempera?
no, it's just chalk and charcoal. Yeah,
So whatever it is, it's beautiful.
it's an extraordinary work. But, so this brings Charles Doherty into this world of Kipnis and Balanchine and Bernstein. It reminds us what a small world it can be. Balanchine worked with Stravinsky. Stravinsky wrote many ballets for Balanchine. And Bernstein became the general manager of the New York City Ballet for over 40 years. So, anyway, I am going to close with, I made a little list of some of the creative geniuses that had found Connecticut to be home, maybe only in the summer. Many of these people had places in New York City, but some of this will surprise you. Marion Anderson, the African-American contralto, who was the first person of her race to sing at the Metropolitan Opera. She lived in Danbury, in a house that her architect husband had designed. Another Met singer was Alexander Kipnis. He was the great Russian-born vassal at the Met. And he lived on Berkeley Road in Westport. Jane Powell, She just passed away within the past month. She lived about a quarter of a mile west in Wilton, west of Newtown Turnpike. Of course, we know Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, Jason Robards Jr., Katharine Hepburn, Philip Roth, Alexander Calder, Arshil Gorky, Paul Hindemith, the great German composer who taught at Yale during World War II because his music was banned by the Nazis. Annie and Joseph Albers, he also was Yale, and he brought the Bauhaus to America. Anne Baxter, she lived in Easton and was an Academy Award-winning actress, and she happened to be the granddaughter of Frank Lloyd Wright. I was in her house once. It's an architect-designed house, high ceilings, and there was a Calder mobile floating. Dave Brubeck, Wilton, Eve Tonke and his wife Kay Sage up in Woodbury. Nearby was Andre Masson in New Preston. He was here to escape World War II in Europe. Nam Gabo, he was also a sculptor, and he was in Middlebury. Robert Motherwell, Greenwich. His ex-wife, Ellen Frankenthaler, lived in Darien. Lynn Redgrave, she was a friend of mine and my wife's. She was an English member of the Redgrave family, and she could have lived anywhere in the world. She lived in Kent. Arthur Miller and Marilyn Monroe, Roxbury. Eugene O'Neill, gosh, his cottage is up in New London. June Havoc, she's been around. She last lived in Stanford. We've mentioned F. Scott Fitzgerald and Philip Johnson. Betty Davis, she lived walking distance from here on Newtown Turnpike. I don't drive by her house without acknowledging that she was the greatest film actress of all time. You can't go into films without studying her talent, her dramatic gifts. Leonard Bernstein, my gosh, he lived in Fairfield, in Greenfield Hill, and his kids still have the house. They use it. They live in New York, but they come out and use it. Now, Bernstein conducted the New York Philharmonic, and after he graduated from Harvard, he attended the Curtis Institute of Music, where one of his teachers was Fritz Reiner. So I find it very interesting that Fritz Reiner lived in Weston and Bernstein had a place in Fairfield, not more than 3 miles apart. Of course they knew each other, And one conducted the Chicago Symphony, and the other conducted the New York Philharmonic. And Bernstein worked with Stephen Sondheim. He's up in Roxbury at age 91. And Sondheim wrote the libretto for West Side Story, which was written, composed by Leonard Bernstein. As a musician, I would like to say, I think West Side Story is the greatest Broadway musical ever written.
Here, here.
It set new standards. Meryl Streep, she's got a place up in the northwest corner. Not far from where Jasper Johns lives, in Sharon. He's one of our major artists. And up in Kent also is Patty Lupone. She is one of the leading Broadway actresses. And her little compound is up in South Kent. Now, I've purposely left the cherry on the top for the last. Yale, I haven't mentioned Yale. And we all know about the art gallery at Yale and the Center for British Art, which was a gift of Paul Mellon. But there are 4 graduate schools in the arts at Yale. There's a drama school. It's now called the David Geffen Drama School. Guess who gave it some money? Think Meryl Streep as a graduate. The music school. This is the graduate music school. It, a few years ago, received an anonymous $100 million gift. There's an art school. I already mentioned Alders as a teacher there for many years. Think Chuck Close, he went there. Richard Serra and Richard Anishkevich, the pop artist. And in architecture, I can't begin to name names, but think Saarinen. So 45 minutes from here by car is Yale, and we have to acknowledge what a great place that is for the arts. So, all right, that's my little talk. Are there any questions? Yes?
You didn't mention Stanley Glypho. He did.
Oh, I knew Stanley very well.
Yeah, he did the sculptures at West Point.
Yes, well,
And other very
I
famous.
had to stop.
Yeah.
We could be here till midnight
You can't do that.
if we kept going. But the point I'm trying to get across is Connecticut is special. It is an amazing place for the arts, all of the arts, writers and poets, painters, sculptors. And I have one parting thought. Aaron Copland told his students, when you compose, make it sound inevitable. So you have to make it so that it's inevitable. It sounds inevitable. So I look at a Calder mobile in Ann Baxter's house, and it's floating around. It looks inevitable. But I know the work that goes into it. Each piece is trial and error. He lost sleep over his work, trying to make it look inevitable. So, anyway, that's my parting thought.
Thank you.
Thank you.